All right, welcome to the Week 6 Forum. This week we are getting to the heart of the matter of American government. Congress and the executive branch is where most of what most Americans think of as politics occurs at the federal level. This week we'll be discussing the role of Congress and the executive in our system, and how each institution needs the other to function effectively, and what kind of coordination has, why that kind of coordination has gotten really harder in recent years, given the fact that I think the House is probably contemplating opening impeachment hearings, is probably a cause for some of that dysfunction these days. Both of these topics are really broad, and there's no way to cover them with the kind of depth and detail they deserve. So you need to do some work on your own in terms of reading and understanding and figuring out what you don't get so that you can bring your confusion to the forum. With Congress, the first thing we need to note is that there are two houses of Congress. Why did the framers create a bicameral legislature? What distinctive roles do the House and the Senate play in the legislative process? How should you think of the role that representatives play in modern government? That congresspersons are expected to represent all of the members of their district poses interesting questions. Can a wealthy man represent the interests of the poorer members of their district? Can a man represent a woman? Can a white man represent the interests of black constituents? These sorts of questions focus our attention on what representation really means. Does a person have to be, have to have been poor to understand the needs of the poor? Edward Kennedy is viewed as historically one of the most powerful advocates for the poor in the history of Congress, and no one thinks he spent a moment experiencing actual poverty. Perhaps the most important attribute a congressperson needs is empathy, the ability to put oneself in another's shoes. Let's talk about it. Another important question revolves around the kind of people that get elected to the House and the Senate. There are a few common characteristics. White males tend to be overrepresented. Congress on a whole is older than the mean of the populations they represent. On average, members of Congress are considerably wealthier than their average constituents, and that tendency is markedly greater in the Senate, which is often described as a millionaire's club. A significant percentage of both House and Senate members have practiced law for reasons that understanding the law can provide a person with an important foundation for drafting legislation. But the fact that members are generally successful people means that they come from the upper strata of their communities. And as a result, they may not be particularly aware of or sensitive to the needs of their more, economically distressed constituents. I raised the issue of gerrymandering in the overview, and I think it's one of the most serious challenges confronting our politics. What are the negative results that come from gerrymandering? What kinds of reforms would you advocate to reform gerrymandering? Feel free to conduct some independent reading and on your own on this or any issue, and bring what you find to the forum. I'd be interested in talking about it because I've read a lot about the issue. Another issue addressed in the chapter is pork barrel politics, which is basically something that results from a phenomenon known as log rolling, where members of Congress will trade votes in exchange for other members' support on their pet projects, which usually include money earmarked for their states or their district. For example, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was known as the king of pork and managed to bring an estimated $7.3 billion in federal funds back to his state of West Virginia, which is why so many buildings and roads and schools are named after him. Look, it's commonplace for Americans to complain about corruption and to decry pork barrel politics and earmarks as a waste of taxpayer dollars and as a source of corruption. But another way of looking at pork barrel, politics is that it's the price of politics. One person's pork barrel project is another person's very important, piece of legislation, which may mean that a road comes in that connects towns in a district and increases economic activity. Or it may mean a veterans center in a small town that lacked resources for veterans. In other words, it's not a simple black or white issue. And the thought that you can scourge corruption and get all the, that federal spending down to just what is absolutely needed, it's not really very feasible. And the dysfunctionality in our politics is largely a reflection of the fact that we've gotten overly sensitized to the problems of corruption. Another important part of congressional organization is the committee system, which provides insight into how Congress works on a day-to-day basis. Woodrow Wilson, who was the only political scientist to become president, once observed that Congress in session is Congress on exhibition, whilst Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work. What are the different kinds of committees that enable Congress to efficiently produce legislation and perform its oversight responsibilities? What's your view on, on the most important committees? I mean, in the news today, you see both the intelligence committees and the House Judiciary Committee are subpoenaing, former presidential advisors. And basically saying you have to show up. Subpoena means it's a compelled, showing up. You don't have a choice in the matter, and the Trump administration is trying to say no, you don't get to do that. So, is the president above the law? Is the president beyond the reach of Congress in its oversight functions? What do you think? The last issue I want to address regarding Congress is its lawmaking responsibilities. First, we should recognize that most legislation that's proposed in any two-year legislative session is destined to fail. Legislation fails for a variety of reasons. Sometimes legislators propose legislation as a stunt to draw attention to an issue that puts them in a good light and is never intended to be acted upon. Sometimes the legislative process uncovers serious flaws in legislation that causes more problems than it solves. Sometimes the legislation is well-meaning but controversial. And sometimes legislation is defeated because it would work adversely for very powerful and wealthy people. It's always important to recognize that the legislative process, when it's working effectively, is designed to produce sound laws that work for the common good. Unfortunately, that's an increasingly rare occurrence. If you look back to the 1940s and 50s, Congress routinely passed in excess of 800 pieces of legislation. And in 1955 and 56 session, they passed over 1,000 pieces of legislation. Since the 1980s, Congress has been less and less effective. And in the 2011-12 session of Congress, they passed fewer than 200 pieces of legislation. And this year's session has been similarly unproductive. Is this a problem? Former Speaker John Boehner once argued that Congress shouldn't be judged effective because of the laws it passes, but rather should be judged on the basis of the bad laws they reverse. Is this a reasonable standard? I throw that out as a possibility. The presidency is our other topic this week. The institution of the presidency reflected the framers' belief that one of the chief defects of the Articles of Confederation was the lack of an executive, but they also recognized that an unconstrained executive posed serious threat of tyranny. Constitutional Convention delegate Edmund Randolph feared that a unified executive would be the fetus of monarchy, and for that reason refused to sign the Constitution. One thing that's clear when you read about the history of the presidency is that the Constitution's framers did not view executive power the way we do. They clearly believed Congress would be the focal point of the governing process, and the president's role would largely be passive and administrative in nature. What caused that change? When did the presidency begin to take on more and more authority? Certainly, crises have tended to expand presidential power, and frequently presidential expansions have set precedents that have enabled future presidents to claim more authority. So, which presidents have tended to be expansionists, and which presidents have tended to see their power and influence diminish over their administrations? How would you characterize the last three presidents? Presidents have both delegated and implied powers, which is, what is the difference between the two? What's an example of a delegated power or an implied power? One of the president's delegated powers has become increasingly a high-profile issue, president's pardoning power. Presidents have a fairly unconditional power to pardon people for any kind of wrongdoing. Why did the framers grant the presidency that power? One of the reasons why was this has become, a heavily discussed issue is that Donald Trump is being investigated on suspicion of having conspired with a foreign power to tip the election in his favor. Several members of the Trump campaign and administration have been indicted and prosecuted successfully, and several have already pled guilty. This raises again the question of whether or not Trump can pardon his way out of this mess. What are the limits on the president's pardoning power? Another issue that's been raised of late are Trump's cabinet team and the numerous scandals that have surrounded several of them. What is the broader purpose of the president's cabinet? Why have so many of his team gotten in trouble? And why have so many of them been replaced? Why does he have so many acting, cabinet members now? To some extent, it appears because now those folks are at-will employees for him. He can fire them whenever. Former EPA Director Scott Pruitt's a former state Oklahoma senator and Oklahoma's Attorney General from 2011 to 2016. He's no longer a member of Trump's team. How would you evaluate Pruitt's overall performance as EPA Director? One other issue that is important for understanding the institution of the executive branch is the vice presidency. Why was the vice presidency created? What constitutional authority does the vice president have? How has the role of the vice president evolved over time? Vice presidents can be particularly important in balancing the ticket. The text discuss, Senator Joe Biden's role in the Democratic ticket in 2008 as providing a relatively inexperienced, senator in Barack Obama with the foreign policy experience that people, perceived that he would need. In what way does Mike Pence, Donald Trump's running mate and now vice president, in what way does he balance the ticket? One of the president's most important informal powers is the ability to go public. What does it mean to go public? It means that the president, to use Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, has the bully pulpit, and alone among American politicians has the power to command a national stage. When the president speaks, people listen. As president, Donald Trump has gone even further, using Twitter in an attempt to circumvent the media, to reach out directly to his base voters. In my view, one important way to interpret the recent events involving whether or not Trump lied when he denied, that he repaid his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, for $130,000 payment to porn star Stormy Daniels, is that Trump and Rudolph Giuliani, his personal counsel, believe that Trump's biggest threat to his presidency isn't impeachment, and it isn't ultimately legal, because they believe that Robert Mueller won't be able, or wasn't able to directly indict him. So rather than make a legal argument, they're making a public relations argument to firm up his support and basically to draw out any attempted investigation of him into the next campaign season. They're gambling that his base won't desert him and that they can intimidate, the independent investigators, and people below the Attorney General by publicly accusing them of engaging in a witch hunt. Do you think it's going to work? The last thing I'd like to briefly address is a growing sense of gridlock gripping American politics and the impact that has had on presidential power. Barack Obama, when confronted with a Congress unwilling to act on his agenda, observed that he might not have congressional support, but he did have a phone and a pen. What did he mean by that? In the text, the authors note that even in periods of gridlock, presidents can continue to act through a variety of means, particularly through the aggressive use of signing statements and executive orders. In short, it means that even when divided government grinds the legislative process to a halt, presidents have the capacity to act. In some ways, that is entirely desirable and in keeping with the role that envisioned of the presidency by the framers. They expected that the president might need to act swiftly in times of national emergency. However, gridlock can also create tremendous incentives for presidents to act without consulting Congress. And it really depends on the nature of the president that's occupying the White House. And that again raises the possibility of constitutional crises, arising, particularly with this president. Okay, this has been a long video, and I hope that I've given you plenty to think about. And there's a lot more in both of the chapters that we can explore in the forum. Which part of these chapters did you think were particularly important or difficult to understand? If you have any questions, please bring them to the forum. or just, call, telephone, or email me.